Hello and welcome to the Human Subject Training Project program. This module covers research in the international setting. Ethical foundation applies to all research with humans, regardless of the location. Federal regulation requires equivalent protection for humans in international research. For the U.S., the expectation is that researchers who wish to conduct international research need to comply with both local IRB regulations and any applicable regulation, policies, or guidelines of the host site. The learning objectives for this research includes understanding the requirement for IRB oversight in the international setting, establishing and maintaining equivalent protections for international participants, and understanding the considerations unique in conducting international research and how research design and conduct should be tailored with these factors in mind. There are several documents that inform and guide how to conduct research with human participants in a respectful, ethical, and safe manner. These include the International Nuremberg Code of 1947 and the National Research Act of 1974, which resulted in development of the U.S. Belmont Report of 1979 and the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations Common Rule of 1991. Together, these documents provided the ethical framework and code for the conduct of research in humans in the U.S. and, by extension, in the international setting. The Nuremberg Code was the first international code of research ethics, published in August of 1947. The code came as a result of the Nuremberg war crime trials of Nazi physicians who performed brutal and cruel medical experiments on concentration camp inmates. The elements of the code were later incorporated into the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations. Central concepts included the need to seek permission from and inform participants prior to their involvement in research, the need to ensure volunteerness of participants, the need to do no harm, and the need to manage risk in research, as well as to strike an appropriate balance risk and benefits in research. The Common Rule codifies a set of regulations that define and elaborate on the expectations outlined in the Belmont Report. The regulations established independent boards, called IRB, to oversee research, explain the expectations for conduct of research, and ensure that participants receive adequate information about the decision to participate through a consent process. The Belmont Report, commissioned by the U.S. President and completed in July of 1979, established a set of basic principles that could inform and guide research performed with humans. These include respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Investigators conducting research with humans must respect the rights of all persons in such research and provide for their welfare in minimizing harms to participants while ensuring they have autonomy in agreeing to participation through a process of giving consent. Investigators further need to ensure their research is of intellectual merit, scientifically sound, and likely to achieve important and relevant benefits for participants and/or society. Finally, researchers need to observe the principles of justice in research design to ensure that certain groups are not selected for research solely for purpose of convenience. Researchers must ensure that research equitability and fairly distributes the burdens and benefits anticipated. The Federal Office of Human Research Protection maintains a compendium of international human research standards that researchers may consult for guidance about research in the country in questions. There are additional code of ethic in human research that may apply, depending on the discipline or study. For example, sociology and anthropology have established codes of ethics for research in their fields, and the World Health Organization and United Nations educational, scientific, and cultural organizations have formulated ethical codes and guidance for biomedical research. So, how do we ensure equivalent protection of participants in international research? The general guidelines include expectations that researchers have appropriate qualifications to conduct research, that they have training in research with humans, and specifically with respect to conduct of research internationally, that they have experience with the locale, people and context of the research, that they have knowledge of the relevant local laws and procedures so as to meet requirements for local ethical oversight. And finally, that they consider all the relevant factors to adapt study designs accordingly. Students conducting research in international settings need to have appropriate training and oversight. Those who would like to conduct international projects should seek an appropriate faculty advisor who conducts research in the location of interest or otherwise has experience with the setting involved, who can provide guidance on context, culture, and preparing a study. Students should have oversight in the location of interest, either through collaboration with the UNRPI, who travels and conducts research in that country, or by identifying a local individual to provide guidance for the research. Researchers collaborating with foreign investigators on a project should identify the appropriate local IRB or ethics committee responsible for review. Most first world countries have well-defined laws and ethics committees in place for review of biomedical research and often social behavior research as well. In developing countries, there may be less structure for ethical review of international social behavior and educational research, or none at all. In developing countries where there are no formal regulations or ethic committees in place, researchers may need to identify alternate officials or contacts who serve in a capacity to provide approval for the research or who can provide guidance on the appropriate oversight officials and procedures. Most international social behavior research may qualify for the exempt level of review, provided that it poses no known risk to participants and falls in one of the 6 allowed categories. Exempt review is an administrative review conducted by IRB staff with experience in ethical review of research. In these instances, ethical review only by the PI's institutional IRB is necessary. Review by an ethics committee or IRB in the host country is not required. For research that poses minimal risk and meets one of the 6 categories, expedited review is needed. Expedited review is review conducted by a singular member of the IRB. This level of review is more involved and requires more detail about the project being provided to the IRB to allow for appropriate regulatory review. Research by an ethics committee is also needed in the host country. Research that does not meet these requirements needs reviewed by a convened IRB at the research institution and also by an ethics board in the host country. Study design and international research. All aspects of study design should take into account the international location. In considering the Belmont principle of beneficence, the research objectives should be relevant to the locale and population being studied and minimize risk anticipated in that setting. In considering the Belmont principle of justice, the research should be reasonable such that the participants or country, locale, will have benefit in relation to the burden and risk proposed. In considering the Belmont principle of respect for persons, the process of recruitment and consent should take into account local context, norms, values, language to balance volunteerness, comprehension, and autonomy to freely participate or not. Because consent is a dynamic process and there is more potential for misunderstanding and misconception with the addition of language barriers and differences in cultural backgrounds, it's important to design this process in ways that facilitates understanding in the cultural context. Translating information to the native language of having an expert interpreter who both functions in the local milieu but also appreciates the research process can be invaluable to improving protections for participants through fostering a shared understanding and trust of the researchers. Levels of literacy and health literacy amongst the population are other factors to consider. Literacy rates in developing countries may be low or non-existent. In this context, alternate methods of informing participants, such as verbal consent and inclusion of a translator when needed, would be more suitable. Verbal consent without documentation to participants and without signatures is allowed in the regulations when reasonable explanation for the rationale is provided to the IRB. For federally funded research, written justification for alteration of the consent process and omission of signatures by participants is required in the application reviewed by the IRB. The consent process needs to take into account local customs and norms so that it is effective in that context. In some cultures, adult tribal members cannot provide consent alone to participate in research, but must have a tribal elder also provide consent for group members to participate. In other cultures, the group leader may be a church leader or government leader who may need to both provide the research and give consent on behalf of the group, in addition to consent being given by the individual. Researchers need to be aware of the unique risks international research may pose to participants as they relate to the cultural content they plan to study. Geopolitical and cultural anthropology research can pose risk in certain arenas where there is political or cultural conflict. Research may pose social and stigma and information risks when performed in a localized group where it is difficult to maintain anonymity of the group. Other research may pose physical, legal, and economic risks. For example, research intended to examine and mitigate illegal drug use and dealings in developing countries. Having direct experience in the region of study can be valuable for assessing risks posed by the locality and the topic of study. In such research, it may be beneficial to consult local community representatives in the design and conduct of the project to ensure that it is conducted in a manner that is effective to obtain important information while also taking appropriate measures to minimize risks participants may face. Much of the risks, when present, posed by international research related to social, economic, reputational, legal, and information risks. In these circumstances, fully informing participants about possible risks to allow anonymity in deciding to participate in research is important. Protecting participants' privacy and confidentiality of data are also relevant in the minimization of such risks. Where possible, providing a private and safe space for collection of data for participants should be a part of research design. Making efforts to limit or eliminate the need for identifiers in data and incorporating measures to avoid indirect identification should also be considered in the research design. A research team is developing a pilot proposal to examine women who recently experienced violence in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez to determine the short-range consequences for them, and do a follow-up examination with the same women about a year later to determine the long-range consequences. The team asks you what the IRB will want to see in the final proposal about human research protection. What are the potential harms or risks, and how may these be addressed by researchers? Potential risks in the study depend on cultural context, include informational. For example, privacy and confidential, reputational, economic, and social. If the culture is such that women do not have equal standings or rights, there may be risks to the group as well. Researchers may also experience barriers to recruiting participants to be in the research, particularly if there are fears of retaliation or reprisal by those who want to prevent potential participants from coming forward. How should researchers address the risk in this study? Implement methods to ensure privacy and confidentiality of participants and the group as a whole. Use a large enough sample to limit ability to identify participants incidentally. Consult with community members from which participants will be selected for additional input on study design protections. A random controlled trial of alternative modes of service provisions to young children with cerebral palsy is being conducted in Bangladesh. Since a large percentage of disabled children live in developing countries, assessment of this sort is appropriate. In Bangladesh, 6.8% of children aged 2 to 9 have developmental disabilities, and 1.5% have a serious disability. 81% of these children live in rural areas with few services for disabled children. In this randomized controlled trial, there are two arms for urban children: center-based mother-child training versus outreach parent training, and two arms for rural children: outreach parent training versus health advice. Initially, the children will be randomized, then the mother will be approached for informed consent. Written consent will not be sought because the female literacy rate in Bangladesh is 26%. Assessments will be conducted before the intervention and at 12 months. At the end of the study, all parents in the health advice group will be offered further intervention to suit the family needs. Outreach training consists of pictorial manuals that illustrate positions, activities, and simple homemade aids adapted for children with impairments based on well-established sources. And different manuals cover motor skills, speech and language, and cognitive skills. The center-based mother-child training is a daily class in living skills, such as using cups, and developmental activities such as sorting by color will be included. The health advice aspect is a box of simple local toys and books for their children to play with at home and no further information. This intervention offers more to children than is available at their local health clinic. Can this study be approved under Common Rule 45, CFR 46, as it applies in the international setting? This study could be approved under the Common Rule. The study design is reasonable to allow comparison among interventions and delivery techniques, and a plan to offer effective interventions to the control group after the study, which allows for a more fair distribution of benefits. There is intent to continue intervention programs long term, which provide for benefits over time. There is an oral consent process in place that takes into account the literacy rate in the region. While this study could likely be approved under the Common Rule, the IRB would likely ask for some additional details about the study to assure it meets approval criteria and the Belmont Principle. The researchers need to provide a rationale for the specific choice of location and choice of disability. The researchers need to address if translators will be involved in the recruiting and consent process. The researchers also need to have strategy for how post-study interventions will be sustained, along with anticipated duration. And for this, it would be helpful to have input from local community representatives. This concludes the module on conduct of human research in the international setting. Please proceed to the quiz for the module located in Web Campus.